Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we have a very special guest. We're joined by Alex Wellman, Marketing and Communication Team Lead at e-residency of E Estonia. Alex, thank you for joining us today.
Very happy to be here.
Absolutely. Obviously, E Estonia and e-residency is a very famous initiative in the innovative governance space. But for those who are not familiar, what is E Estonia and what is e-residency?
So very simply, the program allows anyone in the world to apply and receive a digital ID card that's issued by the Estonian government. And what that means is you can access all of our e-government services, and with the main point being the ability to set up and run a location-independent company from anywhere in the world.
So who would be interested in setting up in a location-independent company?
Yeah, so we see this global trend of people having the ability to live and work where they want and when they want. And we see the private sector has fully embraced this. More and more companies are taking a remote first approach, meaning they don't even have an office. Of course, many freelancers, digital nomads, smaller individuals are taking this initiative and working from where they want. But the governments around the world really haven't caught up to this yet. Most governments still think, you need to live in one place, you work in one place for your entire life. And we are kind of trying to challenge that notion. Estonia wants to be the hub for this new generation of global entrepreneurs and location-independent entrepreneurs. And we want to be the perfect place for them to kind of have their digital home away from home where they can keep their business and everything runs smoothly for them.
So what are some of the advantages of the e-residency program in terms of benefits and registration times, et cetera?
Yes, so the main benefit is when you become an e-resident, we give you an ID card that's a government-issued ID card. It looks very similar to the ones that Estonia issues to its citizens and residents. The only difference is it's not a travel document. So it doesn't allow you to travel to Europe or travel to the European Union or live here, but it's really about accessing services. So for one example is Estonia is always on the top of the list of ease of doing business index and many other business indexes that try to judge how good a place is to run a business. So we really want to spread this to the rest of the world. So really it's about once you're an e-resident, you can log onto our systems, you can start a company completely online. And then of course, administrating that company is completely done paperlessly. So for example, if you need to sign a contract with your accountants or with a client through your company, that can be done digitally using your secure ID card. If you need to file taxes in Estonia, if you're eligible for that, then they can be done in just a few minutes, totally online, no forms to fill, nothing. So really about empowering people to do business and kind of focus on their passion instead of their paperwork.
That's amazing. And as an entrepreneur myself, that would be incredibly helpful. But this initiative isn't completely new. It has its genesis not long after the fall of the Soviet Union when Estonia became its own sovereign country. Can you sort of tell us a little about the history of the E Estonia program and how it came about?
Sure, exactly. So as you mentioned, Estonia was occupied by the Soviet Union for over 50 years. And in 1991, when they regained their independence, in fact, actually, we just celebrated the re-independence a few days ago here in Estonia. But when they regained their independence in 1991, they had an opportunity to kind of start over. So they took the initiative to start from scratch and develop digital systems. So they weren't bogged down by all these legacy systems as far as paper documents and paper files on people. So from the beginning, they chose this path. And it was mainly actually to save money. Estonia is a small country, 1.3 million people, but it's quite big relatively land size wise. So it's about as big as Switzerland or the Netherlands. So it's very spread out, but most people live in the capital, Tallinn, but there's also lots of small villages, small towns where people live. And the government wanted an efficient way to serve these people. So they started to digitize from the beginning. And starting in the early 2000s, they launched a ID card system, meaning every citizen and resident of the country was issued an ID card. And then on top of this platform is really how the e-government ecosystem has evolved. So it started off with the private sector developing on top of this platform, being online banking, meaning you could access your online bank securely through this ID card. And then one of the first government services was tax filing. So if any of the listeners here are American citizens, you can tell from my voice, I'm American, but I work for the e-residency program here. But if you've ever had to deal with filing taxes in the US, you know how much of a nightmare it can be. You know how all the documents and all the PDFs from the IRS can be a complete nightmare. And Estonia from the beginning has really tried to make this easy and simple. And so this is kind of one use case that first developed. And over the years, they've developed on top of this platform. Now, actually, 99% of digital services in Estonia, 99% of government services are available completely online. So that's anything from when you need to register your place of residency, your where you live in which town. If you have like a pet, a dog or a cat, you can register this through the online system. If you need to pick up a prescription from the pharmacy, there's no paper involved. The doctor just uploads it to the platform. You bring your ID card to the pharmacy, and then the pharmacist knows who you are and what your prescription is. So this is kind of how it evolved for Estonian citizens and residents. But then, Estonia being a small country and an entrepreneurial country, they actually thought, okay, we've developed these excellent systems for our own citizens, but we only have 1.3 million people. How can we actually expand this and serve more people? So in 2014, they decided to just try it. Estonia decided to actually issue digital ID cards to anyone in the world. And this is kind of how we arrived at where we are now, 5 years later in the program, where we have 60,000 e-residents from 160 countries around the world.
That's amazing. And I've heard many studies about the impact that it's had economically in the quality of governing services. But I'm sure as the marketing director of the program, you probably can quote them better than me. So what is some of the impact of this program on Estonia?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the program is built on top of existing infrastructure. So we host a lot of delegations from countries here who say, okay, Alex, but how can I do this? How can we do this in our country? But what I always tell them is, this is an add-on service for something you already developed for your own citizens. So in that sense, it wasn't really a huge cost to get it up and running. It just was another category of ID card. So the costs have always been quite low. And as far as impact, the main direct economic impact so far has been, of course, Estonia collecting some taxes from the companies that have been started by e-residents, but also it's about indirect impact. So for example, once you have your company here, you start to work with Estonian clients, you start to take accounting services, you start to take marketing services, other professional services. And we've measured over the last 5 years of the program's history that there's been a direct economic impact of 25 million euros to the Estonian economy. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but considering that the program is extremely lean, efficient, easy to run, cost effective, it's been a net positive gain for the economy here. And we really only see it growing over time.
Absolutely. And of course, there is indirect economic gains as a consequence. One of the studies I heard is that there's been an increase in transparency and trust in the Estonian government after the implementation of E Estonia. Do you think that's had an impact economically?
Yeah, of course. One thing we always think about is that, e-residents, again, the main benefit is setting up and running a company here. And Estonia, can't compete purely on that. Estonia is never going to, can't compete with Delaware or the UK or maybe some offshore type hubs. But what we can compete on is transparency, trust, and those types of values. And I think people are starting to value that more and more. We've seen a kind of backlash against maybe jurisdictions like Panama or other places where we've seen, privacy issues and things like that. So I think Estonia kind of has a middle way. It's not quite a tax haven. It's not quite it's more of an administrative haven. It's about ease of doing business, but with the trust factor involved.
So how does the technology itself facilitate that trust? I know that there's some elements of the platform that uses blockchain, but there's sort of a hybrid model that E Estonia and e-residency uses. What are some of the technical elements of the platform that instill trust?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think there's two main things where Estonia has done differently than other countries who have tried to digitize their services. One of them is called the XRoad, and this is a proprietary Estonian software that's now being shared with other countries. Other countries are implementing this. But basically, the idea is that all of the data in Estonia isn't stored in one place. So, for example, the agency in charge of issuing driver's licenses only knows your driver's license number. The tax board only has your tax information. So there's not a single database where all this data is stored. And they only talk to each other through this secure exchange layer called the XRoad. So this does a number of things. One, it prevents, if there was, God forbid, if there was a sort of cyber attack, which Estonia did suffer one in 2007, which no information was lost or anything, then maybe they would only lose one piece of information. They wouldn't have all of your information. So this is one thing they've developed that's a good safeguard against possible cyber attacks or something like that. And it's something where it's different from, say, India, for example. India has developed this Aadhaar system, which is a digital identity system similar to Estonia, but they chose to centralize the information within one government agency. And this year, or last year also, they've suffered a few attacks and they've leaked data. And when that happens, they have all the information of the individuals. And in Estonia, that wouldn't be possible. And the second kind of principle is this. In Estonia, you own your own data. So for example, whether you're an Estonian citizen or you're an e-resident, you can log on to the state portal and you can see, for example, if a government agency has actually looked at your data. So you can see, and this is done through a system that's similar to blockchain. It's called keyless signature infrastructure. And this is kind of one way that we safeguard against privacy concerns and against, of course, abuses. So, for example, if you give the right to your doctor to look at your medical records, you consent for that. They can do that. But say, for example, you notice your doctor is looking at your medical records at midnight and 1 a.m. Well, maybe something's fishy there. Maybe your doctor has ulterior motive. And you can know that, and then you can report that to the police, and they'll investigate that. And this has happened before. So I think this exchange layer of data between the different agencies and the principle of the individual owning the data are two things that go a long way to kind of build trust and protect the system.
Excellent. This seems to address many of the problems that many in the blockchain and digital identity space have been trying to address for a long time. But for our listeners who are familiar or fans of blockchain technology, can you sort of say what the differences are between XRoad and a blockchain or strictly distributed ledger technology? Yeah,
so I would say that I'm not a huge expert on this, but how I would explain it is this: the KSI, the keyless signature infrastructure that I mentioned that this is built upon is more of a private blockchain. So it's within an ecosystem. So unlike a cryptocurrency where the entire blockchain is public and it's good in that case, in that sense. But this is kind of behind a walled garden, if you will, only accessible to people who have an ID card. So in that sense, it's not quite as open as like a Bitcoin blockchain or something, but I think it's used for different purposes. So in this sense, I think it's okay.
Excellent. But like I said, it seems to allow for some, maybe not data sovereignty because it's still held on a private servers, even though there are many distributed servers, but there's tremendous amount of control of data by private citizens. It seems that it permeates all levels of the e-governance platform. Tell me, why is identity so important for e-governance, and what are best practices for digital identity for other companies in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I know the principle of digital identity from a government standpoint is controversial in many countries. Of course, I know there's whenever there's talk in the U.S., for example, or the UK, people start shouting Orwell. They start shouting this is a little bit too much, and they start worrying about that. But I think Estonia is a small country. They have some maybe more innate trust in governments, which for better and for worse. But really, I think all these systems would not be possible without a secure digital identity, because you need to understand who is interacting with you, inside of the ecosystem. So I think one thing is, for other governments, you need to offer a benefit for the user. So I know, for example, other countries try to maybe only put one service inside of their e-government platform, and then the users still don't want to do it. It's still seen as kind of an extra thing, but you need to make it easier for them. So you need to make sure that the services you're providing are actually valuable for the user, and then you start building on top of it from there. And then you get to the point where everyone demands this service. They want to be able to interact with the government online, and they feel safe and secure about that. So I think that's kind of some of the basics of how you get started from a government side.
Perfect. And I mean, obviously there is this established infrastructure for how the government platform worked, and e Estonia sort of started as sort of like a blank slate. But governments, they're constantly evolving contracts. They're building new institutions, and they have new laws. What is the relationship between the legislator and the e-governance platform? How do they modify each other and evolve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say that in the Estonian case, obviously the legislature, Estonia is a democracy, and they have a parliament, and obviously the parliament makes the rules, but of course they delegate these to various institutions within Estonia, which then are encouraged to build in digital services for citizens, residents, and e-residents. So, for example, the Ministry of Economy is incentivized to have a good company registration portal. So they are given the mandate from the government to make sure that company registration can happen totally online. But then, of course, they are given the freedom and latitude to do that in the best way they see fit. But of course, sometimes governments change within a parliamentary system, and maybe the new government isn't so in favor of these things sometimes. But I think in Estonia, they've been doing it for so long that the general consensus is that it's a good thing, and that it should be continued to be built and modified.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of room to grow, and there's eyes high on the horizon for the program. Even on the website, they have this, it seems like, 20-year plan for where they want to take the e-Estonia program, including things like a digital nation initiative and the e-economy initiative and VR Estonia. Can you sort of lay out in broad terms what the timeline is for the scaling and growth of the initiative moving forward?
Yeah. I think a few key things to talk about. One of them that's really exciting, and probably for the listeners here also, is data embassies. So Estonia last year partnered with the government of Luxembourg, and to have a data embassy, meaning that within Luxembourg there's a server which is considered sovereign territory of Estonia. And within that server is all the data are backed up from Estonia. So as you know, Estonia has experienced losing its territory. It was occupied by the Soviet Union for 50 years. So that's a big concern here. We have a neighbor next door that's still provocative sometimes. So Estonia could effectively run as a nation state without territory, because the information in the state systems are backed up within this data embassy. And they want to create more of those. So this is extremely fascinating for me to think, of course, because you always think about a nation state requiring a few things: population, territory, things like that. But in a way, Estonia could, if God forbid something happened to the Estonian homeland, they could run for a period of time without that. And that's incredible to think about.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. That's like a Neil Stephenson movie.
Yeah, and I think, like, to many people, listeners here, it sounds like something, yes, you totally get that. But I think for the average person, it's maybe a little bit far out. You need to explain it to them. You need to kind of help them understand why this matters. So it's really cool.
Absolutely. But this brings up so many questions. At the point where you don't have a territory, is it a nation state anymore? Is it something completely different? And if there are multiple projects like this in the world, what's going to happen to the Westphalian system?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a political science bachelor's degree, but this is a little bit maybe above my, but I'm happy to opine on it. But yeah, I think it's true. I think as we see more and more of these initiatives, they're going to start pushing back a little bit also against the current kind of nation state model. Because one thing we talk about here is that we see a future of, people picking and choosing where they receive government services. This can be done many ways. This can be done through many of the initiatives that are talked about on this podcast, through charter cities, through charter governments, charter countries, through private blockchain-based initiatives. But I do think there's room, even for within the traditional nation-state model, like Estonia is doing, to offer these kind of services as well. Now, I do think this is going to require a wholesale kind of change in the way we tax people, for example. Taxation is extremely complicated. It's still based on where you live and work and generate value, even though where you generate value is becoming less and less clear. But yeah, we really envision a kind of a time when people are choosing. Maybe they have their pension with this country. Maybe they have their business in this country. Maybe they have, I don't know what other services in another country through an e-residency like program.
Excellent, and I'm glad you're touching on that and how other countries are adapting it. I know that Estonia is working with other countries in order to reproduce elements of their program. But as you mentioned, e Estonia had the benefit of having a blank slate. They just came out of the Soviet Union. They didn't have this momentum and significant paperwork, so you didn't have the problem of huge amounts of stakeholders. But a lot of governments, they have this legacy. So if you're creating or recreating elements of this program in other countries, how do you deal with that stakeholder game and try to bring them all together in order to make them more efficient and to buy into the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think Estonians will tell you that it was even a struggle for them, to kind of get everyone on board with digitizing services. It's true that it's really tough when you kind of have an entrenched society or an entrenched kind of government or people who think, okay, this is dangerous. Even now you see, like in the U.S. elections, people saying we need to go back to paper ballots. But I really think it's about creating trust, creating a framework where people own their own data, like Estonia does, where people can trust but verify what the government's doing. And you need to start from that, and you need to start with building very basic services. You need to start with things where pain points. So, companies make a user journey, and they find out where the pain points are and for their customers, and then they start building services for them. And governments need to do that as well. They need to look at a user journey map of citizens and find out, okay, this is a pain point. What can we do to solve this? And then I think that's how you kind of start and build from there.
I'm glad you talk about the user journey. I'm sure there's been countless discussions about the user journey of the Estonia citizen. And I'm wondering, is there any generalizable principles gotten out of that can be applied to other countries? What are some best practices that e Estonia has created, and how can they be used elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if we take e-residency, for example, one thing that we've recognized is that we issue the e-resident a digital ID card, government issued ID card, and even this piece of technology for the user, while it's extremely easy to get in Estonia. When you're here, it's not so hard to go and get a card or get a new one or something. But, if you're traveling the world, currently you need to go to an Estonian embassy, give your fingerprints, pick up this card, and it can be tough for people. So now that, we have new forms of identity that maybe can be just as secure, but don't require a kind of card and chip to work, we're thinking about new ways to do that. So in Estonia, they have SIM card-based identity systems, which aren't available to e-residents. So we're thinking, how can we issue those? We're thinking about purely, blockchain or software-based identity systems that many private companies are now developing. How can we are those secure enough? Do they meet the international standards, as far as things like eIDAS within Europe for digital identity? So this is something we've been thinking of, that we understand for the customer, for the e-resident, it's been a huge pain and something we've been trying to do better.
Excellent. And I'm glad you mentioned new technological evolutions. In the whole e-governance market, not just Estonia, what are some of the more exciting new developments that you see that are coming to the e-governance field?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, we see people taking this model, and implementing it themselves. For example, we know that Lithuania, just our neighbors to the south here, they just announced e-residency program. Also, we see it in the 50-year roadmap for Dubai in the UAE. They specifically mentioned e-residency, and for me, that's exciting because first it validates what Estonia is doing, but I think these other countries can also do it in a different way. For example, Estonia, for better or for worse, is part of the European Union, and it's been a net positive, I think, if you ask the people here. But it does have some sort of limitations as far as experimentation and what you can offer to citizens. So, for example, we can't automatically make e-residents, citizens or residents of the country. We can't just kind of automatically do that, even though some would say that's a great idea. So maybe some countries who are maybe more independent or willing to kind of to experiment in those kind of stages, I'm really excited to see what they can do. And that's really what's exciting me, is how you can take the ideas that Estonia has developed and maybe improve them and make them more valuable for people.
That's so crucial, the nimbleness and ability to experiment. And as you said, I mean, it's certainly possible with nation states, but it's very difficult. Do you think that small jurisdictions like Estonia and Luxembourg, or maybe even special jurisdictions like Hong Kong or special economic zones, do they have a certain advantage in implementing these systems?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly if you have a special jurisdiction where you can kind of craft the legal system, from the start to be favorable for these types of experiments and these types of services, you have a huge advantage. But I think you of course will run into problems still. They are still part of the the kind of current global ecosystem. Things like organizations like the OECD, they still matter. They still have rules that most countries follow. So for me, it's going to be really, really fascinating to watch over the next decade. Just how nation states react to these moves, because we already see it within Estonia. We have countries kind of sometimes asking us, well, are you sure that this program isn't a risk, for the current status quo? And it's something we need to talk about. So there's pros and cons. I'd really like to see special jurisdictions doing things like this and innovating beyond what Estonia can do. But I also think there will always be a place, for nation states to also innovate and within and really add value where they can add value as well.
Of course. I mean, jurisdictions, they always support each other. Even small jurisdictions like Liechtenstein are implicitly supported by Switzerland. And I'm sure nation states will be supporting special jurisdictions for a very, very long time. But speaking of risks and possible problems, we've been talking very optimistically here, but let's be level-headed for a moment and ask, what are the potential worst-case scenarios for these types of programs, maybe even specifically with e-residency, e-governance? What if there is a illicit company that has illicit behavior, it's doing something strictly illegal, but registers as an e-residency company? But it's hiding its activities? How does e Estonia deal with that sort of scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I would say is that this kind of problem happens everywhere. This is something the whole world deals with. But I think Estonia, people ask all the time, aren't you getting lots of bad companies registering there, etc. But I think it's actually how you approach it. So, for example, in Estonia, the business registry is completely transparent. So, the actual beneficial owner of the company. You can see how many taxes they've paid. And for some people, that's way too much. Some people say, okay, stop right there. That's too much for me. I don't want to set up a company in a place like that. But I think if it's done properly, it actually adds value. Now, there'll always be places where like even the UK, for example, you can register, pretty anonymously for ownership, things like that. So I think transparency in a way that's done properly, that still protects privacy, is one of the best safeguards against that. I think, sunlight is the best disinfectant, It just needs to be done in a way that protects the individual and still allows for kind of the corporate person to operate in an effective way.
Excellent. And do you believe that another way to improve the functionings of e-government, do you think blockchain has a role? Do you think it can improve transparency or governing in any way? Or do you think that the system that E Estonia has is pretty much the top of the top?
No, I don't think Estonia's system is the top at all. I think there's so much more you could do. You know, one thing for me is, you know, I know that some of the listeners here have probably have various thoughts about the value of voting in a democratic way, and maybe, but you know, if you do, of course, agree with this, then I think, you know, opening more secure online voting for things. For example, I'm not a huge fan of direct democracy, but you know, for people who are a fan of that, you could implement something, you know, blockchain-like way to do that. But also, I think it's just about service delivery. So, you know, when you think about a government service, blockchain really makes sense because it really builds in this ledger of all the transactions and allows you to go back and audit those transactions. And it's something where the private sector is held accountable more for that. I mean, you can sue a company if they treat you badly. You can get justice, but with the governments, you don't have this exact level of trust in that. So I think this is where you can really build these systems for citizens and build in the trust using this blockchain.
For our last question, Alex, can you tell entrepreneurs that are listening to this program what is advice you can give them to make these improvements that you're talking about, to take the first steps in order to make a system like Estonia and better global and help governance worldwide?
Yeah, I think it's taking the best practices of the private sector and just and helping governments to understand how to use those. So going to the people, mapping out the pain points, finding out, you know, where the problems are, and trying to solve them. And maybe, you know, I think the problem where government starts from is they think they have to help all the people straight away. But no, just start small. Just take one service, figure out how to improve it. If it's, you know, if it can be done by an existing government, fine. If it needs to be done through a body like a special jurisdiction or through, you know, a charter city or something, try it, experiment. Just be nimble and it's okay to fail. And that's what I really want to, you know, iterate here.
I think we can 100% agree with all of that. Small, don't argue, build, and use special jurisdiction. So that's amazing. Alex, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I've had a lot of fun. I'm sure that our listeners will too. And I hope you have a great day, and I hope E Estonia just continues to grow and amaze all of us.